Today we'll show you 3 different ways to finish your seams without using a serger or overlocker. Plus, we'll put all these methods along with a serged and French seam through a battle royale in the form of a washing machine test to see which seam holds up best. Beyond the 3 seam finishes we're going to cover today, there's also the French seam to consider. While the French seam will be subjected to our washing machine challenge, we won't be explaining its sewing process in this tutorial. We're only focusing on seam finishes that you would use when your pattern instructions specify regular seam finishes. However, we do have a comprehensive French seam tutorial linked below that you can check out. For each seam finish, we will use a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is standard for most sewing patterns. The Overcast stitch is our first contender. It's the stitch that most closely mimics an overlocked or serged seam. It is sewn on your standard machine, however, you will need both an overcast foot and a machine that can perform an overcast stitch. The overcast stitch is roughly 0.5 centimeters or 3/8 of an inch wide once it's sewn. Given that the foot is designed to sew along the seam edge, it's beneficial to trim your seam allowance back to 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. This will make the hem easy to sew and ensure the final seam isn't too wide. At the machine, switch your foot to the overcast foot and choose the overcast stitch setting. Align the edge of the fabric with the straight edge of the overcast foot. Carefully lower your needle and then lower the presser foot and proceed to stitch down the seam's length. Once the stitching is done, you'll see the overcast stitch creates a seam that's pretty similar to an overlocked seam. We'll put it through the washing machine test later to see how it holds up. Next up, we have 2 contenders that require nothing more than a basic zigzag stitch. No special foot required. If you lean towards perfectionism, you may find these stitches are a bit messy, but they get the job done. To make the seam more durable and similar to an overlocked or serged finish, we will finalize both zigzag seams with a straight stitch. You have 2 options for sewing a zigzag stitch, either trim the material before or after sewing. The first method of zigzag stitching is on a pre-trimmed edge. We will begin by trimming the seam back to 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. At the sewing machine, switch to your standard sewing foot and choose the zigzag stitch. A good initial setting is a stitch length of 2.4 to 2.5 and a width of 3 to 3.5, but these settings may need to be fine-tuned depending on your machine and the fabric you are stitching on. Next, align your fabric so that the zigzag stitch extends just beyond the fabric on the outside edge, thereby capturing the raw edge. You might want to practice this on a scrap piece of fabric first to get the positioning right. Then simply sew along the length of the seam. Once the zigzag stitch is complete, head back to the top of the seam and finish with a straight stitch aligned to the inside edge of the zigzag. This adds reinforcement to the seam, imitating the finish of a serger or overlocker. Our next technique is much like the previous one, but with one key difference. We're going to trim the seam after sewing it. Again, using a zigzag stitch and a regular foot, positioning your fabric so that the zigzag will be sewn down the middle of the seam. It can be helpful to line up the sewn seam with the side of the presser foot to assist in keeping your sewing straight. Then simply sew the zigzag all the way down the seam. As with the previous zigzag technique, after sewing the zigzag stitch, we'll return to the top of the seam and finish it with a straight stitch on the inner edge of the zigzag. Finally, trim the seam as close to the zigzag as you can without cutting the stitches. This technique may look a little neater right now, but the real test is up next. We'll be throwing all our sewn samples along with a French and a serge seam into 2 washing machine cycles to see which one comes out on top. As you can see, all the seams survived with varying degrees of fraying. The overlocked or serge seam looks quite impressive, fast and efficient. It's absolutely a worthy investment if you're addicted to sewing. The overcast seam, although slightly more frayed, is still a solid choice, with only a small investment required for the specialty foot. The pre-cut zigzag seam does display a little more fraying, but it still gets the job done. On the other hand, the post-cut zigzag seam does show more initial fraying as its raw edges weren't sewn, but it still holds up decently. Lastly, the French seam, not a single fray to be seen. Definitely a good choice if you appreciate a garment that looks as great on the inside as it does on the outside. And that concludes our Battle of the Seams. If you love sewing, we've got something to help you plan out your creations. Our awesome and awesomely free PDF sewing planner. Jot down your measurements, hack plans, and supplies for every project and add your fabric swatches and garment sketches. Use one of our 4 croquis models or sketch on the blank planner pages. It also includes a collection planner for organizing swatches and styling ideas for mini wardrobe collections and a 12-month sewing calendar. Get all your measurements sorted with our journal and step-by-step video tutorial, which walks you through how to take each measurement. Download your planner for free at madelabel.co/planner so you can get creative and plan out the wardrobe of your dreams.